story.
This one, we were trying to hurry. I think I'll just try. How big is that? No. Oh, yeah.
Hi. Hi.
So you can take your drive out now. Stupid. You don't forget it.
Sorry.
We've done this 157 times before. You're the 150.
I'll start wearing underpants.
I counted last night. This is the 150.
Is that right? My God.
So let me.
So maybe you can, come and show your travel slides sometime,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like in Bombay.
Yeah.
Or Mumbai, I should say.
Desperate for content. Do you want a chair? I mean, are you going to be comfortable? All right. All right.
Before we go online, why don't we do our round the room introduction? So, how about we start in the back corner this time? So just say your name, affiliation.
Julia, I'm an urban planning master student, and I'm going to be studying Vanguard on the.
My name is Christian Snuffman. I'm engineer with David Evans. My name is Adam Margo. I'm a transportation planner with David Evans.
Joe, Assistant Science and Economics.
I'm John, Community Development undergrad.
Cheryl Larson, interested in the Northwest Mall, considering master's degree stuff.
Good. We have a seminar on that topic. So good you're here.
I'm Carlson, the neighboring guy.
And Matt and Oren, you guys want to quickly?
Sure. Matt Barco, first year Merck. Warren Eshel, first year Merck. Colin,
Eating lunch.
Sarah Curtins, sustainability graduate assistant on campus.
John Paul Zagarola, undergrad in environmental science, and I work in the sustainability department at TSU.
Dresden Spees Berger, the sustainability coordinator and facility planning department at TSU.
Peter Bosa, with Metro.
Greg Morgan, Portland Office of Transportation. Ben Kinkley, studying planning, looking at the master's program.
Mark Reesmeyer, interested citizen.
Ryan Oster, I'm a roadway designer at David Evans and Associates. Chris Monsier, faculty member, civil environmental engineering.
Lloyd, PhD student in urban studies.
Oliver Smith, master's in urban studies.
Sally Noble, community development major. Becky Dan, regional planner from Boston, and visiting Portland State, possibly looking at a master's.
Great. Steve Sigadee, Master of Urban and Regional Planning.
Josh Crane, still engineering undergrad.
Ben Zielke, visiting student from Germany.
Aaron Breakstone, master's student in regional planning.
Kayla Costello, economics major.
Stuart Gwynn, City of Portland Office of Transportation.
Sandeep, master's student in civil engineering.
James McCarter, I'm a transit advocate and Central City resident.
Stephen Lewis, Community Development Senior.
Michael Wolf, Civil Engineering Master's Student.
And I'm Rob Bertini. I'm a faculty member in Civil and Environmental Engineering and Urban Studies and Planning, and I direct our Oregon Transportation Research and Education Consortium, also known as OTREC. And we're not quite live yet, so before we go live, and I'll formally introduce the speakers when we do that, I wanted to remind people that questions are welcome and encouraged, and at your table you have a microphone, and in order to activate those, you touch the button that says touch, and keep touching it while you ask your question. If you don't do that, someone, I'm not sure who today will do that, but someone will remind you if you don't do that. So we'd like our internet audience to be able to hear the question. So I think we're ready to go. Did they get their mics on?
Yes.
Yes. So good afternoon and welcome to our 158th transportation seminar. I happened to count last night. I'm Rob Bertini from Portland State University and want to welcome you all. Today, it happens every week that we're in this room just adjacent to 5th Avenue, 6th Avenue. 5th and 6th Avenues, and it occurred to me that there's going to be a lot happening on these two streets over the next few years. So today we're really happy to have Bob Hastings from TriMet and Brian McCarter from ZGF Architects to talk about the Portland Mall revitalization, designing a great street.
Thank you, Robert. I'm going to do a little bit like these movies you see today that start out and then back up in time a little bit. I wanted to start out with the topic of designing a great street. And about, I say, halfway through conceptual design back when we started the project in 2003, a lot of debate amongst the project leaders and team went on about, we really need to step back from the mall. It was done in 1978. We need to step back in this time frame and really look at what it could be. And a bunch of us were aware of this great book by Alan Jacobs. That you guys have probably seen this. It's probably in your library. And so, lo and behold, we decided to step back and do a little analysis and see how the Portland Mall stacked up against some other quote-unquote great streets on the national level. And so we did that. We called and we put out a little book that I don't know if this is still on the TriMet website, but it was an analysis of 6 great transit and pedestrian streets here in the United States. And we use that as a kind of a springboard for further discussion on a design of the mall. So let me just briefly take you through a little bit of that. Are we?
Or enter.
There we go. We wanted to look at the mix of modes that was on these streets, the scale of them, what kind of districts they went through, the history of these streets. Some of these streets you find have been great streets at different periods of their time, and then they've been not so great streets at other periods of time. And so we wanted to really get a feel for that. We did a lot of phone interviews, a little bit of travel, and just kind of compiled this research. Starting off kind of from the top, this sector of 5th Avenue in New York, from Central Park down to Union Square, kind of runs through really the heart of Manhattan's really high-intensity retail district. One of the things we found there that stuck out really strong is that there's a merchants association there that is incredibly powerful, that has a say in everything that happens on that street, from light fixtures to furnishings to sweeping and maintenance. San Francisco Market Street, it's always been one of the more memorable streets that cuts right across the grid in San Francisco and ends at the Ferry Building. It's the most intensive transit street in San Francisco, an incredible mix of modes on the surface and 2 layers of transit below the street. And it's had its high points and its low points over the last half century. And you can see the scale of this street. We think of our 80-foot right-of-ways as being reasonably good-sized street. This is 120 feet wide with, again, a lot of stuff going on it and incredibly wide sidewalks. State Street in Chicago, which was at one time called the greatest retail street in America. It had like 9 department stores at one time. Its own custom light fixtures. It's been the scene of great parades and homecoming throughout Chicago's history, right in the heart of the Loop. Really went downhill in the 1980s and 1990s and was reinvented in the last 10 years, and it's on its way back. Again, another enormous scale street, although when you're in Chicago, 120 feet of street width feels about right because the buildings are so tall, so there's a relationship there. Nicollet Mall in Minneapolis, which was actually one of the first modern-era bus transit malls done in the late 60s by the same team that designed our mall, Lawrence Halprin. This started off with great fanfare, and then within about 10 or 15 years, there was all kinds of detailing and maintenance problems, and it got largely revamped in the mid-1980s. Denver's 16th Street Mall, done in about 1980. This was Denver's prime retail, heart of the city street, and they reconceived it as a transit and pedestrian corridor in the 1980s. This is probably the closest street out of this group that was built with the kind of craftsmanship that the Portland Mall has, with a lot of detail all the way down to furnishings and paving and custom lights. Denver's a little more in our scale. Most of their right-of-ways are about 80 feet, but this is an unusual one. There's really no other vehicles other than these hybrid-powered shuttle vehicles that run up and down the length of it. So it's very pedestrian-oriented. And then our mall. built in 1978 and then extended in 1994 all the way to Union Station. And just briefly, I guess the lessons learned out of this exercise were, and these are my boss Greg Baldwin's words, and I'll try to make them understandable. You want these great streets reveal what's going on and the qualities of them, and meaning the life of the city spills out onto these great streets. It's not behind blank walls and hidden away. The truly great streets need to have a level of finish and treatment that's of a higher quality than the other streets in the city, so it stands out in your memory as a very special place. And the third bullet on there, actually, require proper behavior of all activities. That would mean a simple thing like, would you put your service docks and your loading docks right out on the front of a great street? Probably not. You would try to take care of that on another street frontage or below grade. Accommodate all modes without compromise merely means, and this was a real challenge for us on the Portland Transit Mall, is the great mixture of light rail, buses, bikes, autos, and pedestrians. You have to plan for those so that one doesn't dominate the other. And then the biggest one, which was probably the biggest learning lesson for Portland, and maybe the biggest criticism of the Portland Mall, is it was built at a time with a lot more federal funding than is available today, and it was in a way sort of imposed on the city, and not with the kind of dialogue and the interaction and the support and really reaching out to the businesses that front it. And there were groups of businesses there that really never embraced the idea of the mall. And when there were problems on our mall, you oftentimes heard the comment, well, it's TriMet Street or it's Portland Street, it's not my street. And that turns out to be a really critical factor, because Nicollet Mall there on the right is managed by a private-public consortium who is responsible for security, enhanced maintenance, programming, events, all those kind of things. They have a say in how many buses are on the street. The same with 16th Street Mall, the Downtown Denver Partnership. So this dialogue and engagement of the private sector in what the street is going to be is something that's really critical, and it's something that we've tried to address throughout our project. Bob.
Thanks, Brian. In this sort of looking back and imagining what we would be dealing with the future of the project, it's important to remember that in Portland, so much of what our physical configuration is based on some moves that were done very early in the process. And so part of the investigation, not just in looking at other great streets, but in looking at our own city, was to understand the development of the mall of 5th and 6th Avenues and where that came from, because that has been an iterative process over a series of years. And as the community began to grow in Portland, and 5th and 6th Avenues in the sort of heart of the downtown area, that's, not surprisingly, is where the sort of aggregation of both civic buildings, commercial, and retail activities were happening. The Portland Hotel, which became Pioneer Courthouse Square, was located right on 6th Avenue also.
It's interesting, in this lower photograph, you can already see at this point, earlier in the last century, the highest buildings are starting to define 5th and 6th Avenue as the heart of our city. So they were the primary streets from the beginning.
But in the sort of 50s and after the post-war, with the beginning of the flight to the suburbs of different commercial and retailing models happening, what with Lloyd Center over in the east side and eventually Washington Square happening out in the western part of the city, we saw the decline of the interest in downtown and the removing of a lot of the sort of both historic buildings as well as buildings that had been losing that love and care and feeling from their owners. And so the picture on the right showing the sort of acres of parking that began to emerge in the downtown area, and that original idea of the heart of the city becoming compromised by the sort of actions by other retail and commercial interests. So in '72, under Neil Goldschmidt as mayor, and with a whole host of other folks getting involved, the downtown plan really reestablished what was going to be the sort of principal characteristics as the city moved forward, of reestablishing the understanding of the primary access north and south along 5th and 6th Avenue, with the secondary access happening on Yamhill and Morrison Streets, And Brian's going to point out that right on the edge of that orange spot is also Market Street, which will come back into our conversation a little bit as we developed our design. But the transit mall, as was talked about, again, in those characteristics of gray streets, from the early inception of it, really embodied quite a few of those characteristics that are really important. And for Portland, this establishing of a civic design standard was quite paramount in terms of this level of finish and the kind of activity that would happen along the mall. By also concentrating transit activities along 5th and 6th Avenue, it really helped establish in people's minds the primacy of 5th and 6th as a place both for activity and transit activity to occur, but also for other development to occur. And you'll see that playing out in subsequent efforts. When the Banfield Light Rail came in the 80s and reestablished, again, that primacy of Morrison and Yamhill as that cross-connecting streets, Pioneer Square as a development of the place in the heart of downtown really helped kind of manifest that and make that very clear. But even the development of the sidewalks and the streetgate furniture and finishings along Morrison and Yamhill were very intentionally done, and that carrying through of that palette of materials to, again, reestablish in people's not just literal interpretations, but just the sort of whole feeling through downtown.
One of the things I think you'll see as Bob describes these different transit corridor studies and projects as we go over this 25 years is that the mall kept being revisited as a potential corridor to add rail transit of some kind. And each step of the way, there was an effort, well, maybe we should think about the mall. Should the mall be our next rail corridor? And I think there was a pattern there that we knew eventually that was going to be the thing, but there was other projects to build before we got there.
And this phrase about building community, that really became, I think, a kind of a civic aspect of Portland in particular, was the inclusion of a broader community in that dialogue, of seeking out other voices and other ideas as that conversation was happening, that it wasn't going to be just a sort of guarded planning and design effort only visited by a very few and then presented to the leadership and decision makers. So it's a much more populist kind of conversation. And as that continued through any other expansions of the mall with the extension north out to Union Station, every move along the way was really scrutinized and talked about to a very high level, and the materials that were used and the places that they were done weren't presupposed or prejudged at every step of the way. That's been talked about. So in the further study that Brian was alluding to, when we got to the West Side project, bringing Gresham into downtown Portland and then taking Portland out to Washington County, that sort of transference of the look and the feel of the materials that were being used, even as it crossed into the Tualatin Valley and out to Washington County, is amazing to hear as we're involved in the design process. Both, well, I want it to have the quality of what the downtown mall's about. At the same time, they're saying, yeah, but I don't want it to look like Portland. I don't want Portland out in my area. And so there's that kind of betwixt and between of what are you doing that's specific to the place, but yes, also allows a kind of an individual district or character interpretation to come through. And you'll see that again as we get sort of further into this analysis. The other point to make is Brian's alluding to, in looking at this extension of transit into the larger regional connectivity, the subway was studied quite a bit, wondering if we were to allow that sort of higher speed and higher capacity movements through downtown, where would that go and how would that link into the surface, much like other cities have done around the country. But we kept coming back to, primarily because of the cost is extraordinary to build that, and the levels of people that are using that system, that's this trade-off, how much are you paying for versus how much ridership are you really going to provide. And without going into all the permutations that were looked at when in the South-North study, it kept coming back that, that surface light rail transportation does allow flexibility and does allow choice and sort of more fine-tuning and fine-grain positioning of where stops would go and how they'd interact with the neighborhood. On Interstate Max, which kind of grew out of the ashes of when South North, as a $1 billion-plus regional transit initiative, did not pass, either in Vancouver, Washington, or in other parts of the city. It allowed, though, that conversation of transit and growth and planning to still continue. And so in North Portland, what was established was a very large urban renewal area in order to provide the TAC instrument financing for the project. But the point of it, in terms of its urban design and as its community involvement, was that it still was very much about engaging the folks in the neighborhoods where transit was going to be provided. In fact, finding out even late in the planning process that some subtle adjustments would have really important manifestations with the neighborhood connectivity or with other development activities that might come out of that neighborhood kind of ground-up development conversation.
One thing that's interesting about Interstate Max, it is, you could call it the north leg of the original north-south line that we didn't build. And its relationship to the transit mall is we decided let's get our foot in the door on our eventual full north-south alignment, because ultimately this wants to go through the middle of downtown and it wants to go on another set of streets besides Morrison, Yamhill, and First, because ultimately we're going to run out of capacity to run trains through our 200-foot block. So this was taking that tiptoe, or maybe even a bigger step towards ultimately setting us up so that we could put trains on the mall. There was some parallel efforts that went on about this time, and actually this is interesting, all during the 90s, because South North was kind of looming on the horizon as the big project that was going to come through and really upgrade the mall, add light rail service. There was maintenance problems on the mall that needed to be repaired, and so there was this conversation that went on, well, we'll fix it when we do South North. What ended up happening is that became a repetitive mantra that we kept pushing out deferred maintenance farther and farther and farther. At one point in 1994, we didn't know how long it was going to be before we got out there with the next major transit project. So PDOT, with the city, initiated an effort to go out and just, well, let's just fix the mall right now. Let's repair it in its current design state. And so we went through an exhaustive study, documented every broken brick and damaged bench and chipped paint, and put some estimates towards that. But again, by the time that effort kind of came to fruition, we were close enough to South North that everybody decided, well, let's table it for a minute because we'll come back and do that when we do the big rail project. Well, by the time 2000 came along and we weren't going to do South North, a bunch of the downtown leaders, the Association for Portland Progress, brought in the Project for Public Spaces, Fred Kent, and said, what are some things we could do down here to really kind of bring back? There was some areas of changes in the banking industry that were leaving vacant storefronts. There was some shifts in the retail industry, and they really felt like, how can we bring back the vitality of the mall while all this conversation is going on about future transit corridors, and really try to bring it back in? So those were things that were going on concurrently.
So out of this sort of the ashes of South North, the efforts of the Yellow Line extending out to the Expo Center, still in everyone's mind from a regional planning perspective was the need to provide for further extensions of the overall transit system. And so, I get to use this thing if I can. Here at Clackamas Town Center along the I-205 corridor was where our next extension was proposed to be. If you've been out there, you know this is ultra-wide kind of planning effort that removed everything just the freeway for almost miles and miles. But what they did allow for in that acquisition of the right-of-way was for future transit alignment to slide through. We weren't really sure if it was going to be heavy rail or light rail. So one of the big challenges of a project like this is finding that right-of-way. And so really it was sort of presupposed that it was going to happen along I-205, but the station areas that were going to happen along here still hadn't really been defined. But what we knew is the kind of ridership that might occur in this area. We've been building enough of the system and seeing how the models played through that we had a better sense of, if you build it, they will come. Yeah, well, how many are going to come, and when will they come, and what times of day will they use it, and for what will be the impact when they arrive downtown. So this began to inform us as we looked at the downtown 5th and 6th avenues we would come. Would we stop short by Market or Main Street or continue on down to PSU? And also thinking about the future and if they would extend into Phase 2, would it come down to Milwaukee or continue down to Oregon City? And the right-of-way, think about the alignment coming across the river, how would that happen at the Carruthers Bridge? Where would it actually go? And then how would it sort of slide through southeast and into the neighborhoods through here? So a lot of those conversations already were beginning to happen in that effort with the South Corridor environmental impact statement study that was done. But it influenced a lot of what we were thinking about on the mall project, of understanding that, yes, this is about the downtown, but it's also now about a regional sense of connectivity. And you'll see that it, quite frankly, influenced a lot of why bringing light rail to Portland State became a key component to the whole project, as well as Portland State understanding that now their regional connectivity was embedded with how the mall project was going to proceed.
And there was a conscious effort here this time around by the agency leaders and planners is this time when we build this next corridor, we are going to get the downtown piece built. There's no way that we can go off and build this and not add that transit capacity, nor can we defer all the work that needs to be done on the mall because of repairs and things like that. So the decision was made, we're going to at least get through most of downtown and finally get that north-south pair of tracks established there and set up for the future. You want to just talk about the process?
In this sort of wide process of everybody coming to the table, TriMet obviously is kind of the host that's providing but everybody has to bring a covered dish or a salad or some other part of the meal. Portland, the Bureau of Planning became much more involved with this, and talking the fuzzy way. Oh. We didn't really do this technical change out really quick.
So anyway, I'll pick up here. It was a multi-agency effort, really an incredible amount of cooks in the kitchen. And we had major citizens advisory committees made up of business leaders, citizens at large, downtown residents. We conducted numerous workshops, open houses to really, it was unlike I think anything TriMet's done before, the outreach effort on this one was tremendous to try to really let the community join and follow along in this and influence this design process.
And sort of one anecdotal point to make about that, when we originally started thinking about doing the mall transit project, it was about the mall. And it was thinking about, well, we're going to fix some things and we're going to add light rail, but we're going to do it in kind of like we did with streetcar, this sort of precise, just cutting in and won't disturb anything. We're just going to lay it in, and that's all we're going to have to do as that project. And what we found, and again in the conversation with folks, was that the city had evolved and the citizenry had evolved and changed, and the expectations and needs also had changed a lot from some of that earlier thinking about the project. So it's not to describe it as now using another analogy of a Christmas tree where everybody's going to throw a lot of ornaments on. It was that the fundamental precept of what this project was be for the city and for the region really had shifted, and it changed, become much more of this inclusive project.
Yeah.
So the goals that we sort of stepped back and rethought about in the conceptual design process was very much about how will this enliven the life of downtown and the life occurring along the mall. Yes, how can we get at renovating it, but how can we think about in the design and engineering process the sort of micro scale of things that will help us maintain and provide that level of quality for a much longer duration and be more mindful of the dwindling dollars of maintenance that come to that. Yes, we want to protect and strengthen the core, but the retail core also has been changing. It wasn't a series of just sort of large stores with small shops. We're finding, as Brian had alluded to in the earlier studies with People for Public Spaces, as well as other studies, that the nature of shopping and retailing had changed, that the streetscape itself had moved from this transit shelter as a little house for transit activities to becoming much more of a public space that everybody's moving along and wanting to have that visual connectivity of your environment, but also the activities that are going on around that. that the access we're talking about expanding, it's for light rail, but it's also about bus, and a recognition about automobile use, but also recognition that Portlanders were discovering other ways to get around. So bicycles, certainly to the level of activity that they are even gaining every year in downtown. Segways, skateboards, you name it. If they roll, Portlanders are going to use that. How do you, my gosh, where do you find examples of streets that have done all that in one space? And quite frankly, nobody in their right mind had done anything as crazy as what we're about to propose to do.
This is a good point to reinforce that balance of modes comment I made before, because I know from all of our workshops there have been transit and pedestrian advocates who have shown up who've said, why in the God's name don't you just kick the cars off of this street? Then you got the whole thing for transit. Well, interestingly enough, if you look at some of the history of pure pedestrian malls in America over the last 30 years, a lot of them have not worked. And whether you attribute it to that to other factors like suburbanization or something like that, the fact is and Morrison Yamhill was used as a model, having that single lane of auto access, just one lane, allowing people to preview where they're going and find a garage if they're going there, or pick up an elderly relative or something like that, changes the perception of how open that street is. And from a traffic engineering standpoint, you look at a thing like that, like a single lane, it's only maybe 200, 300, 400 cars in the peak hour. That's a trickle in terms of what kind of traffic a larger arterial carries. But the business community and the members of our Citizens Advisory Committee and all the committees we're designing with were very adamant about we need to, when the mall gets redesigned, we need to take out those blocks that divert you off, the ones where there's fountains and super wide sidewalks where you're forced to take a left turn, and allow there to be continuity there. And when the traffic engineers play that out, it doesn't all of a sudden open the floodgates to thousands and thousands of vehicles units, because it's regulated by cars that are stopping to turn, by the fact that it's a single lane, by the fact that transit has priority with the signals. There's a lot of other things that inherently calm that traffic down, but it was a major effort on their part to let us have some continuity there for looping around the block, for service deliveries and things like that. And as it played out with our friends from the other modes, I think our bicycle advocates came in and said, fine, we like the continuity too. Let's make it a multimodal lane where they can ride freely on there. So that's kind of how that went.
The mall, though, again, as an act of community participation, of thinking about the materials and the actions that would happen along these great streets, it kind of elevated, I think, Portlanders' understanding and expectations for what urban design should do. Not what it could do, but what it really should do. And as folks have been involved with the design process, it's quite frankly have pushed us to try and do more in looking at what this project was going to be about. And so some of the elements that were in the original project, the benches, the brick crosswalks with the granite circles, we understood that those aren't just sort of precious artifacts that are kept around for historic thought. They're actually a part of how we understand the public space that we're moving through and how we appreciate what's going on in front of us. So that as a city is emerging and as a city is growing in the public spaces that we all share and use, Portlanders use them. They expect and demand a lot of activity, be it the Waterfront Park or Pioneer Courthouse Square, or even up in the park blocks. And so this recognition that the mall, yes, it's highly valued and highly participated with, but it's also going to be, it has to have a sense of refinement, it has to have a sense of quality that can withstand all that hard love and attention that it's going to get. It's not precious.
So we're about midway in concept design, and at this point, the city brought on a new director of urban design, Arun Jain. I think you might have met him. Really talented guy coming to us from the Bay Area, who had the benefit of coming into Portland and looking at it fresh and didn't have all the 30 years of baggage that all the rest of us have. And he and his associates embarked on about a 6-month study of the mall, looking at the mall in the bigger context of the central city and where things are going. When the mall was done, we didn't have thousands of people living in the Pearl District or in the West Side. So the nature of downtown was really evolving. It's a bigger downtown. And I think he advocated very strongly for let's take a look at it in the bigger context. And this is just kind of a quick summary of some of their findings. The level of activity up and down the mall from one end to another really varies. There's parts of it that are dead. There's parts of it that are very lively. There's parts that are incredibly developed to high density. There's parts of it that have one-story buildings on them that probably will have much larger buildings at some time. There's a lot of important, now as downtown grown, there's a lot of important connections from the mall to the east and the west that maybe weren't there before. If you look at downtown, there are subtle and maybe not so subtle shifts in character as you move through. For instance, the University District is kind of an emerging thing on the mall. It's more established over on the park blocks, but it's definitely, with the new buildings reaching out over to the east, it's beginning to establish its presence here. There's a very definite character district around City Hall and the government buildings and the Chapman-Lounsdale block. There's definitely the retail core in and around Pioneer Square, and there's definitely a banking and financial and hotel area at the north end of the central area. And then there's more of an historic neighborhood feel and the transportation terminus. So what he advocated for is, as this mall we're thinking about moves through all these things, maybe there's some ways that that diversity and that distinction can be reflected physically in the design of how we approach this. So this next series is we began to kind of layer this thing. I'm shifting you now. North is to the right, Union Station's to the right, PSU is to the left. We laid the alignment down, and here's the first phase turnaround on the left side down here at Jackson Street, and eventually it would go on to the Milwaukee alignment. Then we began to, with the help of Arun and his staff, began to look at in purple and kind of the lilac color, what are the obvious redevelopment parcels up and down the mall. And if you look at city policy, our mall was put on 5th and 6th Avenue, and our zoning with our FARs and everything like that was put into place to encourage our highest density development on the mall. So to have one-story buildings on there is really not utilizing a $500 million investment in transit to take it up and down there. So this began to look at, and you can see in and around our end of the woods down here, from the urban center, which is right here, along the east side of 5th, there's quite a bit of redevelopment potential and even some infill in between. So we began to look at, in and around each, where would you put stations within each of these districts and what is the potential? Obviously, in the middle of downtown, it's pretty well built out. There isn't a lot of open opportunities. But up at the north end, also with the post office and the UNR blocks, there's potential for significant development around stations there. So this began to give us a framework. Well, we were having so much fun with this big philosophical debate about what the mall is going to be. We remembered we also need to get down to the nitty-gritty details and figure out how would you actually engineer and put a light rail trackway with buses in this 80-foot environment. And so we began to look at a number of different configurations. This one was what we call the left side operating option. Our trains can open to the left or right. It's got that flexibility. This one was looking at what if you took those blocks I mentioned before that happen in the Central Mall that have fountains and super wide sidewalks and double rows of trees. If you decided to do left side station, those pop out as obvious choices to be potential stations there. If you're running the track in the middle of the street so that buses can still use the right-hand lane, the curb is already out there on those wide sidewalks, so that became a natural to look at. And we're still thinking we've got to afford this project, and we can't rebuild the street from wall to wall. So that became an obvious choice. But again, it doesn't allow that auto continuity and that bike continuity through there, so it had that drawback to it. But if you did that, what would that look like? And here's in the middle of the mall. Here's where those wide sidewalk blocks would occur. At the north end, the south end and the north end, the stations stay consistent between the alternatives. Then we also, after quite a bit of struggle, I can't remember how many different configurations there was, right, wide right, driving on the sidewalk, about everything imaginable, and different configurations. We finally our friends at TriMet started to look at the idea, what if we treated train like a bus, and it runs down the center of the street. When it comes to a station about every 4 to 5 blocks, it gently weaves over, unloads, and then weaves back. Well, that sounded good, but we knew, boy, this is going to be an amazing ballet between buses and trains doing that, switching back and forth. So I think we spent about the next year with the best experts in all of those engineering and planning disciplines, testing this idea out and modeling it in computers and signal timing, all that safety concerns to really make sure that, is this an idea that could really work? And the outcome of that was that we finally came to a level of confidence that it could work. There isn't anybody in the country that's done this before, but we felt we were on good ground. It does mean an adjustment in the volume of buses that will use the street. Right. And part of that is driven by the fact that some of the bus lines coming downtown will be, that service will be taken over by trains. Other is we're figuring out ways to shift some of our bus volumes over to like Columbia and Jefferson. You guys notice how many bus lines have shifted to Columbia and Jefferson now? So there's some of that going on, but also it's looking at, if you look at a greater map of downtown and look at light rail on this alignment and our existing alignment, where buses are coming in and where streetcar in, we're trying to get transit to cover a bigger area and allow people more options for getting around both on transit and on foot. So here's how that played out, and I think this is where Arun's wisdom came into play here. If we went to this right side option, it all of a sudden frees up the flexibility to put the stations anywhere we want, because you can pull over the train. It has nothing to do with where the curbs or the auto lanes are. So that allowed us to shift this station, which in the previous scheme was 1 block to the south, right to the heart of the city, right at Pioneer Square, and allow us to do an amazing transit nexus there where east, west, north, south, people coming into the city that want to go in a different direction, the transfer is right across an intersection. It also allowed us to shift the station at Washington Stark 2 blocks north to Unico, which is the state's largest office complex, the highest density, the biggest building. There's a number of people in this area, and plus the remaining financial area around here. And it really started to, as the more we thought of it, it started to make sense that this is Unico is a hub for this whole neighborhood. It's got a whole retail concourse on the ground floor. Then our Cooch, Davis, and our Greyhound North Terminus Union Station stations stay the same. Bob, you want to?
Part of the investigation with the Bureau of Planning was also working with PDC, the Development Commission, and sort of doing a bit of their legwork. We tried to understand what were the things about development that the transit project would respond to. Part of it was understanding that the project itself had to become more maintained, had to do things in a different way than what we do before. And out of that began to grow this sort of attitude that maybe we should have a project that is becoming more of like how the private sector would take care of the projects. And what grew out of this was this thing called a mall management team. And this is a sort of public-private consortium, like was explained at Nicollet Mall in Minneapolis, that would say we're going to make a commitment about the maintenance and the activities of the mall on 5th and 6th Avenue. But there's other things that we have to do in terms of explaining what's going on, programming some of the activities that are happening, finding a way to provide a higher level of maintenance and security and cleanliness than would any of us be able to do on the public side by ourselves. And so this public-private partnership, again, grew out of this desire for both the agencies to perform at a higher level and leverage the funds, the paltry funds that we can bring to the conversation, but also provide some certainty from the public side that with their participation, this hybrid would help them all perform to a level that would really matter to them as property owners and as retail providers. So when we went into preliminary engineering in the summer of 2004, we really had, I think, a very clear picture of what this project had become. We created this local improvement district, which is a way for businesses, and this is when I tell people from other countries who visit the United States and hear about this project, and they hear that the businesses tax themselves in order to add money to the project to get at a higher level of finishes and service than it would have otherwise, they're quite frankly, they're stunned. That just does not happen. You don't have that kind of sort of openness from private enterprise to participate in a public project like this. But this, again, was part of this evolution of the project itself, and so we went to the FTA, and we could really talk about how are we going to bring this project in on budget, on schedule. But one of the huge things that we could talk about with a higher level of certainty was the risks of doing this project in such a public space. By this participation, it lowered that sort of fear and concern that had happened in so many other projects when you look across the country, in Boston and in Chicago and Los Angeles and New York and other places, Denver. There's a lot of problems that can happen in a project like this when there's not that sort of higher level coordination between the public and the private side.
So, just so you guys can get out of here before 5 o'clock, we're going to kind of fast forward through a few of those middle phases and jump into final design. And interestingly enough, you saw this diagram before. When we went back and really looked at some of the historic documents of the original 72 plan, which was really a seminal plan for Portland, it was really the plan that kind of turned the ship in a different direction for Portland. What a subtlety that was lost on us maybe before is that this plan really envisioned a unified central kind of core area running from Burnside actually to Market Street. But interestingly enough, when the project was built in 1978, for whatever reasons, it only went to Madison. And then a couple years later, Pac West was built, and that owner decided to install the improvements to match them all on his own nickel. But it really officially ended at Madison. And so our business leaders and our Citizens Advisory Urban Design Committee said, you know, when you really look at the nature of downtown, and here's Madison and Jefferson, Wells Fargo Tower, 1515 building, Southwest Fifth Avenue, it's really a continuation of that office core. It really feels like that should have been included in the original kind of carry of the brick and the lights and the shelters and those Central Mall themed improvements. So that was one of the first things we jumped on is that character of streetscape improvements ought to be extended all the way to Market, which coincidentally is the boundary for the University District. You look on the street signs there, and that's the beginning of the University District. So it made it kind of a natural transition right there. So kind of in diagram, extended down to Market Street, that's what that would look like. Then at this point, there was a pretty interesting thing we did. We decided to kind of really open up and pull in some of the wider spectrum of great minds in the design and planning community. So we started this, I think it was about a 6-month or an 8-month effort. We called it the Station Area Planning Process, and we actually contracted with outside architects and designers and planners to help us drill down more into this idea of station as place and what should the different characters. So we had SERA and Marassi Associates take on the Old Town stations plus Unico. Walker Macy, who was the original landscape architects for Pioneer Square, came in and advised us on the station around Pioneer Square. And Thomas Hacker Associates took on the whole, they are the designers of the building we're in, took on this whole South Mall University District area. And that turned out to be an incredible, I got to say, that was an incredible thing to open it up to, you know, what does the mall look like to other sets of eyes? And it was really a creative, energizing process. And I'll get into that more as we go into that. We also, at this time, we were signed up to go through design, the Portland Design Commission, which is our official body here that reviews private sector development. If you're going to do a building in downtown Portland, you have to eventually get approval with the Portland Design Commission before it goes on for building permits. And so, as a courtesy, what's happened throughout Portland's history, even though this is a public right-of-way project, not a private property project, whenever it's a non-standard, elevated, enhanced improvement in the street, it's taken through as a courtesy through the Design Commission so they can comment on it, particularly a project like the mall, which is more than a street. It's a civic space. And so as we got back into the 1988 Central City Plan, which is still the standing plan on the books until they update it, there's a number of recommendations in there that pertain to the mall. They called for extending the Union Station and down to 405, recognizing the distinct areas, forming a gateway here at 405. And so we began to look back over some of these plans. this is some quotes from the Design Commission. The Design Commission weighed in very strongly on the side of continuity. They felt like the power of the Portland Mall, when you're an outside visitor and you get to that thing, as you look at it, it's unmistakable. It doesn't look like Broadway. It doesn't look like 4th or 3rd. It's a memorable street because of its physical character. So we then went through, I guess you guys are familiar with the Central City Design Guidelines. It's a pretty large document now. There's a series of guidelines that individually talk about various design goals in there. And one of the things that's interesting as you dig into those, you realize the Portland Mall is sort of embedded in these things. A lot of these guidelines actually use the Portland Mall as an example of what they're talking about to aspire to. Things like Portland themes, the rose, the heron, water features, the rain, the mountains. You remember the symbols on the side of the bus shelters that had those kind of graphics on it? That was very, very much driven. This idea came out of that, of celebrating that idea. The guidelines thoroughly recognize our unique small blocks, which creates a lot of intersection, but it also gets a lot of light and air into the city. And it creates a lot of pedestrian vitality because there's people coming from so many different directions. This is probably the biggest single one that the Design Commission kept hammering the table on, is use unifying themes. And that's one of the strengths of the Portland Mall. And it plays out and you'll see later when we get into how we felt strongly we needed to hang on to the brick in the intersection, even though it had been such a definite maintenance problem. They talk about reinforcing the pedestrian system. And again, what better example of the pedestrian system is there than 5th and 6th Avenue with the wide sidewalks, the manatees, and the trees? Even down to the design of the sidewalk, the guidelines now very formally recognize, the traditional zones of a sidewalk: the furnishing zone, the through zone, the transit boarding zone. And again, the mall kind of embodies that, and these guidelines really kind of refer back to the precedent that the mall set. And respecting architectural heritage, and that's written more for historic buildings, but it also can be interpreted to think about those iconic elements that were in the original mall design that still have a lot of validity, and how is there a way that we can hang on to those things and refresh and renew them. And then building active intersections. For us, designing the right-of-way, that means recognizing we don't put a bunch of stuff there that really compromises how people can use the corners and the intersections. That's where everybody gathers before they cross the street. So this is just a little bit of background reference that I wanted you to remind you when we're designing a project like this, there's a lot of public policy things that come into play. So here you have this strong idea of urban rooms and station as place, and yet this kind of directive to be aware of continuity. So how do you reconcile these two kind of forces? And I think the answer is you do both. There are ways to have threads of continuity that let you know wherever you're on the mall that you're on the mall, but in Arun's word, they also let you know where you are in the mall by things being distinct, certain things being distinct. So this is how that kind of plays out. There's this powerful continuity in the central area. In the South Mall area, I think what Thomas Hacker advocated for is that the east-west streets in this neighborhood are almost as important as the north-south streets, 5th and 6th, because the university is growing to the east, and streets like Montgomery and College are clearly identified as corridors. They're going to link from down to 4th Avenue through this area all the way back up to the core campus on the park blocks. And something similar in the North Mall with the development of the festival streets on Davis and Flanders, the idea that those could be embraced by the mall and eventually even work in the future to extend those linkages all the way over to the North Park blocks. So, starting from kind of the big picture, there's a number of obvious elements that are going to be, that are these threads I talk about that really run from the one end of the project to the other. There's going to be brick pavement in one form or another, or one color or another, that really kind of ties the whole area together. There are a number of fixtures that go along with that. The traditional Portland light fixture was successfully adapted back in the 80s with a shaft coming out the top to also be an overhead electrification support. You've seen this, I'm sure, on Morrison Yamhill. Well, the added complexity here in the mall now with the introduction of trains and buses is our safety folks said we have to have overhead signals. We're not going to be able to have rely just on the little side-mounted traffic signals, because you have places where a train driver, if he's coming up to a block and there's a large bus here and a garbage truck there, he can't see those side signals out of the front of the train. And if somebody steps out from behind a vehicle, there's no way he could get his train stopped. So what we did is we went back to the drawing board with our engineers and we said, okay, there's going to be overhead wires there for the electrification system. Could we beef them up and hang the traffic signals on them? So after quite a bit of head bashing in a few months, we decided we could do that. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't the conventional way of doing it, but in the interest of kind of simplifying and keeping the number of poles and hardware minimized, we were asking these poles to do not one thing, but three things. So, and then out of that kind of grew this idea of a family of poles, starting with the very biggest ones and then working your way down to just the smallest. There'll still be side-mounted poles with pedestrian fixtures on them, but we wanted the whole system to look like a related family.
Probably the biggest one of two things that had the most level of scrutiny and conversation, and at times some really heated debates. The iconic mall shelters, which were built back in the 70s, and everybody began to identify the downtown area by the shelters, understood that to be the architectural element. What we also began to understand, though, was in this talk we said earlier about the changing nature of downtown and what had been evolving around the mall since the development occurred, was that the shelter, as in a way like a little house where you go in for protection from the elements and you'd find transit information, also had become places for other people to go into and do all sorts of things. And we were there could be bathrooms, they could be, well, anyway, we won't go into all the detail of it, but a hotel. But we're getting that sort of reality check that what was really their contribution on the streetscape. And the new concept of a transparent shelter, both for visual connectivity, wasn't just about the safety and a sense of security for a transit patron. It was also for the transit person to be part of what was going on in that wider streetscape, that the Association for Public Process and the People for Public Spaces, telling us that the real streetscape was from building face to building face, and that even inside of the building, the activities going inside there informing what was happening out into the common place. And so this transferring of the idea of the little house into more of a ubiquitous, transparent activity center really informed what we were going to do in that next step. But it was also this, as Brian had just alluded to, the appreciation for the need for flexibility depending upon the circumstance. As we've been drilling into all this, we began to understand that, yes, we had to have continuity, but we also had to have a high level of flexibility depending upon whether you're a Pioneer Courthouse Square, PSU, Unico, North Mall, all over the place, with trains and buses and cars and bikes and people. That nuance of how to make adjustments became very important for all of those behaviors, again, to be able to form at the right level without one compromising the other. And it had to have a level of quality that, again, was embodied in what Portland expected for this key area in downtown. And so you can see in this range of sizes of shelters, with also the flexibility of adding windscreens depending upon the conditions of wind and rain and where it was, depending upon where you were in downtown. So this is the family design that we're carrying forward into our final design, and we'll continue to develop the details of that through this year. But we'll have that more as a kind of ubiquitous treatment through all of the mall downtown, and perhaps even to other places too, so that notion of the quality of Portland extending beyond downtown would still happen, or could happen. Even the signage elements, which we tend to have to be the sort of large, blocky, red porcelain enamel behemoths along the transit system, in downtown they couldn't have that bulk, that size, that materiality that was getting banged and dented on. And so they became sort of taller, slimmer, kind of a cleaning up of the architecture and the symbology that we're using to let people know that, yes, this is the bus stop and that's the light rail stop, but there's a host of other things that are going on too that make it very clear so you'd know whether you're at a bus or a bike stop or a train stop. Even, and we were talking about just this morning, that in the downtown area, when you're in the Central Mall, with the trees now that have developed over 30 years and the canopies quite a ways up in the sky, has a whole different level of feeling than when you're in the North Mall with a different species and a different configuration of the streetscape and the size of the buildings. or in South Mall, where there's a variety of different species, and some, because of the placements, they don't have that kind of rhythm and rigor that you see in other parts of. But that's part of that element of distinction that happens through the landscape architecture, not about just the built form. So we're now looking at all the assemblage of materials coming together. You know, the bench, which is still an iconic element, still has a very high functional need, but it needs to be transformed into a longer lasting and easier to maintain bit of furnishing. The bollard picture, the fellow leaning against it on the right, we discovered actually was intended to be a bike stand, which of course never functioned that way by anybody ever. But it does function very well as a place to sit and lean down, put your cup of coffee. We're even teasing into the notion of, is it possible to collect together all the wonderful newspapers and other magazines and free materials into a ganged rack where it frees up more of that streetscape area, but again lets people know where they're going to be able to find those materials. So all the way through, we're looking at sort of a fresh eyes approach to the amenities and furnishings that we'd have along. Bike racks, leaning rails. The piece in the lower right picture is, we call it a tad pad after the artist who came up with the idea. But it's understanding that when you're on the street doing a variety of things, having the place to put the cup of coffee or put your computer or sit down and do the crossword puzzles, those are the kinds of activities that encourage that life on the street to occur throughout. And so finding ways to allow that to sort of sprinkle through, not just at the transit stop, but on both sides of the street throughout the whole block face. So the elements that you're familiar with in terms of our light rail station, those will continue. The tactile dome pavers as you board and deboard the train, ticket vending machines to use it for the regional system. We've actually found a way to take the electrical cabinet from the sort of a Mano refrigerator down to a much more sort of compact dorm size, but again to be more responsive to the kind of activity on the street.
That's right. In the Central Mall, I'm going to go by sector now. The Central Mall really embodies all those things that you just saw, runs them through there, and probably the biggest thing that we had probably a year and a half head-banging debate about was what to do about the intersections. And when you go back and read those original design reports by the original architects, they were very strong about those intersections being that continuity of the pedestrian system. It's really a different street when you think about brick sidewalk, asphalt intersection, brick sidewalk. It doesn't quite have that same sort of continuity of that ribbon of that red brick. And it really sends, it's always, over the last 28 years, it's given that message to motorists that you're entering a pedestrian zone when you go through those intersections. And so, that said, from the other side of the coin, from the PDOT side, was these have been the biggest maintenance nightmare of anything in their system. These intersections, because they were built with what we call rigid set mortar set brick, which is inherently a problem with buses because of their loads when they're full of people, that it was the first thing that they wanted to get rid of. And so we had to have a major coming together, and we actually went to England and got a internationally recognized paving expert who deals with what we call flexible set pavements on sands and aggregates, which is done all over Europe. And we brought him over here through a series of meetings and workshops and develop a system that we now feel relatively good it's going to work well. And so we're in the kind of the final stages of refining that. And we were also interested in the role that the circle originally played there. It kind of defined where you're supposed to cross the street. It gave a little bit of a cue that the automobile continuity drove through there, but you're still crossing brick crosswalks. But in this new technical system, you don't want to, that's one of the failures of the old malls, soft asphalt, thin granite, rigid set brick, thin granite. It's so many different systems coming together, and when the buses roll over that, they pound it with their rear axles, which are so heavy. So with our paving expert, what he really advocated is you need to pick a system from one end of the intersection and run it all the way through. So if you want to express a circle, you need to do it out of the same material that we're building the rest of the intersection out of. So we experimented with a variety of different pattern makings, and finally this is the latest one that we think is going to be the winner because it doesn't interrupt our basic pattern. And we actually had a brick supplier here in town mock up a quarter of an intersection so we could look at it out at their yard and see how visible the circle was, and I think we've now got it down to something we feel pretty good about. Bob.
Questions come up from a lot of folks about the art program. In the original mall, art was played into the central component. That's going to continue. We're going to take all the pieces off. We're going to actually clean them up and get them kind of restored back to their pristine condition. And then we're going to look at, again, where should they be positioned? How can we arrange them so actually people could perhaps even walk around the art and actually understand it maybe a little bit better, so it's not just sort of plopped willy-nilly. Plus, we're going to add to that collection with some new pieces to sort of extend the time period from the 70s now up to more current day. We're also going to, in North Mall and in Central Mall, have an artist developed elements to sort of create more of a characterization for the area that's distinctive, again, with the neighborhood. Again, that station is place and elements of distinction. So the art program will be part of that.
I'm aware that we're probably running long here, so let me try to pick this up a little bit. Just individually around these stations, if I can hit them. At City Hall, one of the things that we discovered in looking at this thing, you know, we're advocating for distinction and continuity. Well, when you look closely at the area around Pac West and City Hall, there's about a 5 or 6 block area here where the buildings are actually pushed back from the edge of the right-of-way and actually have gardens and front lawns. That in and of itself gives this a distinct area, and we're going to be locating our station platforms on either side of Pac West, which has one of the nicer ground floor retail environments of many of the larger office buildings in town. So it's got kind of a character, and our main task here is not to wreck what's already there, to try to tread sort of lightly with our improvements. Just an example, at the University Club, the front plantings, the heritage tree, we actually heard from the city's Bureau of Buildings, they actually didn't want us to do anything to the front of City Hall because they just recently restored it back to its kind of historically accurate concrete sidewalks, motor court, restored the balustrade. They just said,
no bricks.
No bricks, don't touch us if you can help it, and that's fine. That's part of the distinction. Pioneer Square, the moves here, again, it's already a great distinctive place to tread as lightly as we can, but there has been a long-held desire. If you look at back when the mall first went in, the courthouse was very prominent. This is before the square was even built. The Myron Frank Garage was here. But as the square was built and the trees grew up, over about 30 years, the courthouse just disappeared because it was behind this kind of monolithic treatment that the mall has on every block with 2 shelters and 6 trees. And so there's been a long-held desire, and Doug Macy was an advocate for this. Could we remove a few trees now that have gotten so large and actually open that view up? And so this is a kind of a concept sketch. Here's the courthouse. Here's the center of the square with the kind of formal center line running back there. We've actually removed a few trees right here in the center and pushed the shelter and the other furnishings out to the edge just to kind of have that. You see it a lot in formal government buildings and in Europe, where there'll be a dynamic kind of palace building at the foreground or right at the end of a plaza. So that's what this is all about, is to try to have that courthouse finally have that relationship to the square. And there's some talk about even enhancing the uplighting of buildings around there to really kind of play up the uniqueness of that 2-block area. Am I talking about this one? Unico, I think we mentioned, this is you, actually.
In bringing again in the outside team of designers, SCRA and Marassi, seeing the possibilities by having more of an integrated idea of the transit stop with the development. If you go down to Oak Street now, and you notice the plaza in front of Unico, pretty forlorn, windswept, it's a great place to maybe write really stark music. So we've talked with the building owners and said, would you want to partner maybe in some of the fixing up that you're planning on doing with the notion of having the transit stop there, and again having more of an integrated idea. And so, next slide. We're going to really look to enhance the view angles for the art that's around there, to kind of clean up and replace the sidewalks and the bricks throughout. To look at doing perhaps a lighting intervention with the streetscapes through there, to kind of to amp up that sense of brightness and illumination as you kind of as a prelude for crossing over Burnside too.
Right. Go, Bob. This is still you.
North Mall with a hackers team. Again, the sort of shifting here was, with the North Mall extension that Brian worked on with ZGF. The scale of the street is a lot narrower. The building heights are a lot shorter, but there's a kind of a scale of it that is very about a neighborhood, and So the art treatments that we're going to go through there are actually going to occur at the platforms at Cooch and Davis to kind of have that quality and level that's more about the variety of things that are happening in Old Town and Chinatown throughout the mall, rather than the sort of civic grandeur of Central Mall.
It's really fortuitous that one of our platforms actually ends up located on, in my opinion, the best block in the North Mall. It's where Three Lions Bakery and all the clubs and art and clothing stores are. So it's going to take already a really great active block and animate it further by having the station. You'll be able to sit out there and have a coffee and walk 10 steps and step on a train and go to your next destination.
Union Station, as that sort of foyer to the city, there's a lot of other ideas percolating about what should happen out there. And so in the planning that we're having with Morossi and SCRA was, how can we begin to maybe sort of set up some of that conversation of connectivity, of the urban design treatments stretching across Irving Street, both to Union Station, but also in recognition to the west towards the Pearl District, and what would be some important connecting points with Gleason and Hoyt. And so as you can see here, there's the Greyhound Station, which it's kind of losing its presence, level of service, better or worse, and but might be poised for more redevelopment in the near-term future. The blocks just to the west of it, the U and R blocks, are identified by PDC for redevelopment. Is that going to happen tomorrow? Probably not, but will it be happening eventually? Absolutely. And so we want to be clear about what we were doing on the transit project and setting up that importance of Irving Street as that sort of north gateway for us. Here's South Mall.
Here's South Mall. So here's Tom. Here we are. Here's our site where we're going to turn around. Here's the urban center, kind of a collage there. So here's Thomas Hacker Associates drawings, and I think they were, again, they saw Market Street as that kind of cutoff point where the Central Mall character would stop, and this is really the University of Jersey. You can see they're already in this sketch from 2 years ago beginning to suggest Montgomery and College as potential green streets or pedestrian-oriented streets. And they went on to develop some really interesting kind of sustainable stuff. We all got inspired by this shot from Michigan Avenue in Chicago, which is a great retail street, but this idea of introduction of lush planting in a high-density retail environment. And we started to think about it. Well, what if it didn't have this lip here and the sidewalk drainage could actually drain into the landscape, and you're getting 2 for 1. You're getting the beauty of the green area, but you're also taking some of the stormwater volume out of the system. So we started playing that out further, and we knew there was going to be places where we can't have soft landscaping, where we're getting on and off of buses and trains and stuff like that. But we started to look into what's been done in Europe. And they've developed some paving systems there now, and this is the one we're going to carry forward, where we actually set the pavers on little plastic spacers on an aggregate bed, spread them apart, and fill the joints and seal the joints, or seal the gravel in the joints with a binder, but allows the water to run into this pavement. You can walk over it, but it's still, you get the stormwater retention and infiltration that you're getting with the soft landscaping. So I think that's something they advocated for very strongly. Then in the tree species, what we've developed here is we're going to let there be this diversity of tree species for the immediate next 20 to 30 years, but as some of these maples and things begin to reach the end of their life and or are taken out by a project, we do have a new species where we can begin to infill that over time, and then slowly but surely, maybe 50 years from now, you begin to have more of that powerful kind of continuity of species that you have in the Central Mall with the plane trees. And it begins to give this area really a distinctive look. And we're also going to, this is something you don't realize, or at least I didn't realize it because I just assumed it, but this part of the city doesn't have the twin ornamental lighting. I just thought it was everywhere. And I drove around one night and realized, no, it's not everywhere. There's still wooden poles and highway Cobra head lights and overhead wiring and stuff. It's because a lot of the high-density development hasn't happened here. This project is going to bring the ornamental lighting all the way to the southern terminus.
And speaking of the southern terminus, Jackson College Station, it will be the turnaround spot for trains, and it also would be between College and Jackson, our last two, the first stop on 6th as you head north and the last stop on 5th as you're heading south. But anticipating that movement to extend the system south to the future, because of its primacy and being seen by everybody, usually this is a sort of back-of-house place where we put a bunch of poles, the trains stop, and it's kind of considered as a sort of back door where you don't do much. But this spot is going to be seen by everybody in West Hills, OHSU. So it's visually very very important as a focal point. And certainly as we extend to the south, we anticipate this would be kind of a gateway as you come into the downtown area. And so Hanna-Berry Eddy architects have been brought in to look at the arranging of that sort of operational equipment, but doing it in a more sort of artistic way, maybe having some sort of larger art element to really sort of signal that, bring together all of our sustainability initiatives with stormwater filtration, alternative energy, PV panels, wind turbines generating power, all kind of happening at this merry little spot on the south side, and actually be a place where our operators do take a break, but it'll be in this sort of wonderfully visual, accessible spot that's right on the seam on Jackson Street, where development to the north would happen in partnership with PSU. And we know that PSU is very intrigued in having more sustainability initiatives in that kind of development. So we're hopefully setting up some of these win-win opportunities for both of us.
And I think finally the urban center, which is already a great. Do you guys realize? I guess you probably do realize this. The trackway cutting across the block like that was originally planned for that south-north project, and light rail was going to go down Harrison Street. Well, when that vote died and that never came through, right about that same time, Streetcar came through and said, "Well, we could use that." Mm-hmm. And Thomas Hacker was so far into their design, it was really problematic to kind of start all over again. He already had the gap in the buildings there, so it became this great new kind of place where campus meets downtown, and it's an incredible gathering place. And so now, with the addition of light rail now, parallel on 5th and 6th, plus all the bus service is going to be in and around here, this is really going to be probably the biggest transit hub in the region in terms of riders and the mix of modes. So one of the things going on, as you guys, as you know, there's going to be a new student rec center right across the other side of Montgomery. This is an incredible opportunity, knowing that transit is coming, to break away from the traditional, here's a building, here's a little shelter out in the sidewalk. There's a chance here to really think about ground floor retail activity, weather protection in an integrated way, so that the architecture of the station and the architecture of the rec center all kind of come together into one kind of integrated whole. So it's a great thing to look forward to. And as a distinctive place, we already made the choice up here to change to a slightly different brick color, slightly different shelter that we did back in 2001. So it has some kind of distinguishing qualities already.
Finally, at the end, just to kind of give a wrap for this, is that, well, we're almost to the wrap, but it's not been just about the physical characteristics. It's also been about the sort of human organizations. And so the mall management now is a formalized 501c3 nonprofit, has a board, and it will be the entity that will manage the mall and safety, security, and cleaning and programming of activities and events. It allows a sort of hybrid public dollars to come in with private intervention too. And so they'll be the ones who'll be sort of carrying on and following up with the mall activities as it goes into the future. They'll be the ones that when the phone call comes, hey, a car just ran into a bus shelter, get out there and fix it right away rather than waiting for TriMet to sort of get to its response. But also the ones that have probably the best opportunity for talking to their own businesses and retail folks, changing the sort of little window that you look at retail to more of a kind of a gregarious involvement with what's going on in the streetscape, and having that sort of outside and inside barriers opening up more and being more a part of the active life of the street.
So here we are. We're under construction now, as you guys have figured out by now, with all the buses moving and the jackhammers and the piles of gravel everywhere. And it's going to ramp up incredibly here in the next 2 months. By the middle of March, what we call our first civil reach starts up, and they're already beginning to store rail up here underneath the freeway. So you're going to see a lot of hubbub. We do have a great team in place, though, to kind of keep the dust and the commotion down, and there's signage up so you can find your way to the businesses that are still operating on the mall. But it's going to be an exciting time, because this street's, in a matter of 2.5 years, hopefully, it's going to be like this. You're going to be able to, your transit service will be back on the mall and expanded. You'll be able to ride from PSU to Clackamas Center and not even get off your train. Mm-hmm. So we're really looking forward to it. We'd like to open it up to questions. Yes?
Well,
I guess your presentation revealed a lot of this, but I was just wondering if you could be explicit in saying, you started off the presentation with 6 examples of great urban streets, and you sort of tried to analyze them to see what made them great. But I was just wondering if you could sort of be explicit in the sort of values that you used to determine what your 6 urban streets were that you were going to look at. I mean, what were the qualities that you were looking for that made you think that they were great?
Yeah, Brian, what were they?
I think what we did is we took a poll amongst a bunch of us who were in the business, both within the agency and the design community, and made a short list and said, what are the great transit and pedestrian kind of great streets around the country in cities of our size or larger? And we might have maybe we left a few out of that mix, but I think the list that we did come up with are considered the ones that have been the most successful. There are a few transit malls that have literally been wiped off the face of the earth, and they're no longer transit malls. They're gone. Mm-hmm. They either didn't work for operational reasons or...
Philadelphia tried that. And so we had examples of transit locations where it hadn't worked, and we tried to figure out what was it about that. And it tended to be a sort of a monoculture thinking about one mode has to dominate. One mode has to have everything out in front of it. And it was here, how are we going to accommodate the variety of things? And that was such a different equation than what we were seeing. And so the ones that we used as examples were the ones that seemed to have a way to get into the design, the pedestrian realm, that it was being honored in a wonderful way, as well as a connectivity with transit and trucks and trains and all that kind of stuff too.
I think we were also looking at cities that have put the effort into keeping their hearts vital. We didn't go looking for transit and pedestrian streets, for instance, in Detroit or places like that have really had a history of struggle with vitality downtown. But if you look at the track record of Denver and San Francisco and Minneapolis, there's been not only transit's probably a sidebar issue. There's been considerable effort on the private sector and public sector parts to really rejuvenate and preserve and keep those downtowns strong. And I think in each case of these examples we use, they're located in the hearts of those cities, in the very core areas. And so I think if we were going to get any kind of feedback that might be valuable for Portland, we had to kind of look in those terms, I think.
Other questions? Yeah.
One of the elements that kind of stood out from a lot of the images in the Great Streets discussion was a certain kind of patio, restaurant, bar, patio culture that doesn't seem to really have ever materialized on a large scale here. Has that been addressed in the design? Is that something that's being encouraged? Is there room for that? Is that a regulatory issue?
One of the things that kind of came again out of just this open-ended conversation was, and this was partly done through the surveying of Arun's group. That was also Tad Savinar, an artist who was part of our design team. We called it the block-by-block strategy, and it was actually looking at every block and asking the question, what could happen here? What's good about what's going on, but what might change that would increase that sense of vitality? And sometimes it was just a smaller intervention of, say, if there's that blank window, that behind it could be that retail presence coming out. Or maybe it is like down at the Red Star restaurant, which doesn't have any kind of on-street dining, but how could they, in this wide sidewalk, allow that to spill out? And so we've gone through and talked now to all these institutions about what's, again, that role that they could play in participating in the street. Not something that we're necessarily designing for, but we're also not precluding that activity from going on. In fact, we're trying to sort of promote that and, again, get that participation, because as we talked about the very instance, the thing we did see was when the public realm is participating in that street, in the life of that street, that goes far beyond anything that we could build just in bricks and mortar.
That is a fabulous question, because that's something that kind of kept hitting on us all throughout the last 3 years. And it goes back to that comment I made. I think when the Portland Mall was originally built, there wasn't that kind of engagement and conversation with the shop owners and the retail owners, and they just felt like, it's TriMet Street, it's Portland Street, I don't want anything to do with it. I'm not going to put my tables out on there. That said, the other thing we've heard continuously throughout the last 3 years is, the volume and the noise and the diesel exhaust out of the buses has never made the Portland Mall really a conducive environment to want to sit out and have a tea and talk to somebody. It's noisy. Well, I think there's some things on the horizon that are beginning to take that in a different direction. You can see Rock Bottom Brewery, where the station has got a microbrewery and cafe tables out there. That light rail seems to have a little bit more softer manners when it comes to that kind of thing. Plus, there is on the horizon a move towards quieter vehicles, I think, in the future, more hybrid vehicles, and the volume of buses is tracking a little bit down lower. We're going to be going from about 140 buses an hour in the peak in the old mall before we moved it, down to about 90 to 95, I think, when this opens with light rail. So what you're going to see is a little bit more reasonable balance. But it's a great question because on my phone conversations with the Downtown Council in Minneapolis, they deliberately, and I don't know what the level is, but on Nicollet Mall they said, that's it. No more buses on there. If you want more bus lines, do it on 2 parallel streets to either side of it because we'll drive the cafes out of here if that happens. So it's a really, really good point.
Yeah.
Some of the mature sycamore trees are going to get the axe. You mentioned the ones by Pioneer Courthouse. Are there some other sections where we might lose some of those mature trees?
Yeah, there is. Overall in the project, we've done a pretty thorough inventory. There's somewhere on the order of between 700 and 800 trees. We're going to be taking out about 170 or something like that total. We're going to be putting back probably more trees, but of smaller caliper when they go back in. That has been another one of these things that's been hotly debated. We have got people on the absolute... people who would chain themselves to the trees, and then we've got, interestingly enough, the AIA, Local Urban Design Committee, and even some of the landscape architects feel like the street's overgrown and almost dark because of it. And we even got a hold of some documents from Lawrence Halprin that indicated when he first planned the planting of the plane trees, he knew they grew fast. Albeit they had some disease problems, but if that could be overcome. He knew they grew fast and it would have impact quickly. But I think he always intended, because he had a European sensibility, he had intended that those trees eventually would be what's called pollarded, which they do in Europe, where they heavily prune back the head to keep the spread from getting so big. We never did that.
Right.
And so a great example, and I've even changed in my career in 30 years here over thinking about, because I designed the North Mall with tree spacing about 22 feet apart, and I'm here to say I regret it. It's too heavily planted. It's dark inside the windows of the buildings and stuff like that. If you want to see a great example at mature size of what really works in a 200-foot block, look at the 6th Avenue side of Standard Insurance, right across from the Gus Solomon Courthouse. Those are a set of 4 sycamore trees that were there before the project was built. That's why they're so far back from the curb. But there's 4 trees spread they're about 40 to 45 feet apart, and it's perfect. You still get some sunlight, but there's plenty of shade, but it doesn't overwhelm you. But throughout the rest of the Central Mall block, there's anywhere from 6 to 7 plane trees in a block. They're 24 feet apart. I mean, the trees are 45 feet wide in their branches, and it's a lot of foliage.
Yeah.
And so you can see there's a lot of debate back and forth on this. But
Yeah.
Last question. The light rail going down 5 and 6, is there any plan to keep through the mall, keep the fairless for the light rail?
Yes. It's almost become a birthright in Portland. Associated with it, though, has been a lot of concern that with not having the bus operator sort of being with the patrons riding on the bus, there's things that are going on the train that cause people concern. So our response has been not to take away the fairless activity. It's to find ways to, have a greater security presence and, step that up a little bit more. But it's been talked about through the project. It was kind of a rumor that this is going to be used to sort of wipe that away. And at this point, it's so embedded in what's happening to Lloyd Center that it's going to stay on. And that's a key part of why we're taking buses off, knowing that the light rail would provide that kind of looping connectivity from north to south that you had come to rely on with the buses today. But now the sort of guessing game of how far does it, we just did it today, how far does the bus go before it turns down, light rail, the whole thing will loop through there.
Can we do one more?
I'll try to make this quick. I was going to be a little long, but do you think that it's going to be a great street with the bus stop spacing? What I'm envisioning is someone on a bus, they see something they want to go see, and it's going to be 3-4 blocks before they get off. How is it going to be a great street with that? But also, I want to agree that while it's nice to have all the bus service on it now, it really makes a problem with having a great street with all the diesel lost. And I think the Nicolay Mall actually went down in their buses originally.
I think the characteristics, I think the transit service and the transit spacing is just one characteristic of a great street. And I think we've had a lot of conversations with transit advocate groups. I mean, I've talked to you at the workshops and everything like that. And we're trying to find a balance and a trade-off here between, we've all gotten used to the convenience of the way the mall was with, you stop every other block. I mean, what could be more convenient? But that has service impacts, and when you mix trains into there, you just can't have all of that cake and eat it too. So I think that trade-off in kind of not having transit kind of dominate the whole environment down there, but have it reasonably convenient. And actually, we've heard from a lot of transit advocates who have actually complained about the blue line and the red line stop too much. Throughout downtown, it's slow. They stop every 2 blocks. And on 5th and 6th, we're going to be about 5 block spacing, which is going to move quicker.
But we're finding out even now with the shift of taking buses off during construction over to 3rd and 4th, that spacing is greater than where they were before. And so we're really watching and observing and listening to see how is that spacing, in fact, working with people. Because that'll kind of pre-plan a little bit of how when we make the shift back to 5th and 6th with the block spacing, what's that going to mean. So.
Sorry to cut it off, but we're at the end of our limit. So if you have other questions, feel free to come up, talk to the speakers. Before we thank Bob and Brian for their presentation today, next week's presentation is from Boris Travinsky, the senior aviation planner at CH2M Hill on airport master planning and forecasting for Unalaska Dutch Harbor, a case study. So with that, let's thank Bob and Brian.
Thank you very much. Thank you. 102 slides.
Yeah, thanks for sitting through that show.